An ultimatum without a document, a peace without a name. Wars, as every statesman eventually discovers, are not ended by courage, justice, or even exhaustion. They end when the story that sustains them becomes more expensive than the violence itself. The war in Ukraine has not yet ended. But it has entered that most undignified of stages, professional management. This is the phase in which the guns continue to fire, the speeches continue to echo, and the casualties continue to mount, while the decisions quietly migrate elsewhere. Not to parliaments or summits, but to spreadsheets, contracts, and calendars. The recent Russian strike using an Orshnik missile against gas infrastructure near Lviv did not mark a dramatic escalation. It marked something far more modern, a revision of assumptions. The missile did not seize territory, it adjusted expectations. Soon afterward, according to diplomatic whispers that are suspiciously consistent for something officially denied, Washington conveyed to Kiev a proposal described as a time-bound peace roadmap. This phrase, like most diplomatic phrases, exists to ensure that no one is later accused of honesty. Call it what it is, an ultimatum with good manners, no paper. No signatures, just a deadline, nature's most effective negotiator. Strategic liquidation. When war becomes a holding pattern, for nearly 2 years, the war in Ukraine was framed as a struggle that could not be compromised without moral collapse. This was a useful framing. It mobilized publics, unlocked budgets, and gave the war a metaphysical quality that discouraged uncomfortable questions. But metaphysics has poor credit ratings. Eventually, even the most righteous war must submit to quarterly review. Not because its cause has weakened, but because the institutions funding it have limits, elections, and alternative priorities. Thus Ukraine's war has entered what might politely be called strategic liquidation. The goal is no longer victory in the traditional sense. It is risk containment, preventing loss from exceeding what accountants would describe as acceptable exposure. Wars do not die when they lose meaning, they die when they lose novelty. Orshnik, Moscow's note to the energy desk. Russia has fired many missiles during this war. Some were brutal. Some were symbolic. Some were aimed at morale, others at infrastructure. Orshnik was aimed at memory. The target, gas infrastructure in western Ukraine, was militarily unremarkable. It lay far from the front lines and close to NATO borders, a location that maximizes political discomfort while minimizing escalation risk. This was not a battlefield message. It was a market signal. By striking energy infrastructure tied, historically and psychologically, to Europe's comfort, Moscow reminded its audience of an inconvenient truth: the continent's moral clarity is inversely proportional to its energy prices. Russia does not need to win the war, it merely needs to ensure that no one else wins cheaply. That is a modest objective, and therefore a realistic one. Washington after Trump, the audit phase of idealism. Under Donald Trump, American foreign policy did not become cynical. It became literal. Trump did not reject values, he priced them. In this worldview, Ukraine is not the front line of civilization. It is an asset, strategic, costly, emotionally overvalued, and increasingly illiquid. The alleged ultimatum, reportedly delivered through intermediaries such as Steve Witkoff, reflects a managerial instinct rather than a diplomatic one. Wars, like infrastructure projects, are expected to reach completion. If they do not, they are rescoped. Every conflict must have an end date. If it resists one, it will be assigned one. This is not about pleasing Moscow. It is about reallocating attention to China, to domestic politics, to anything that promises better returns per dollar spent. Morality, in this framework, is not abandoned, it is amortized. Kiev, when a symbol discovers it is non-fungible, there are few leaders in recent history as admired as Volodymyr Zelensky. His transformation from entertainer to wartime icon was swift, sincere, and effective. Ukraine became not merely a country, but a moral reference point. This was an extraordinary achievement. It was also a strategic trap. Symbols inspire, but they do not negotiate well. They cannot easily retreat without tarnish, compromise without contradiction, or adapt without accusation. The paradox of Ukraine's position is this: the more morally indispensable it became, the less strategically autonomous it grew. Washington no longer asks Kiev what it wants. It asks what Kiev is prepared to live with, and who will cover the cost if it refuses. The ultimatum, if real, does not depose Zelensky. That would be crude. Instead, it renders him unavoidable yet overruled, present in the room, absent from the final decision. Europe, principled, unified, and powerless, Europe's position in this war has been admirably consistent in rhetoric and painfully inconsistent in capability. It supports Ukraine, it condemns Russia, it fears escalation, it fears resolution. A long war drains European industry and patience. A bad peace would confirm what many Europeans privately suspect, that the continent remains a security consumer, not a provider. The strike on gas infrastructure near Lviv was a reminder that Europe's strategic autonomy still ends at the thermostat. In this context, the idea, once heretical, of restoring Russian gas flows through Ukraine, overseen by American firms, begins to resemble pragmatism rather than betrayal. Europe does not want to choose sides, but winters insist. Gas and the franchise model of peace. Nothing suits Trumpian diplomacy more than a peace that resembles a corporate restructuring. The emerging outline, Russian gas, Ukrainian transit, American management, has an elegant cynicism. Russia earns revenue without diplomatic rehabilitation. Europe receives energy without confessing dependence. America controls leverage without responsibility. Ukraine remains relevant without autonomy. This is not peace as reconciliation. It is peace as governance, not Westphalian sovereignty, but outsourced stability. The ultimatum's real function, ending pretense. The ultimatum is not designed to end the war. It is designed to end the illusion that the war is still defined by principle rather than price. When Washington introduces a deadline, it signals that the moral narrative has run its course. From now on, the decisive arguments will be numerical. In that language, courage does not compound. Sacrifice does not depreciate gracefully. Russia, adequately satisfied, Russia may not emerge triumphant. But it is unlikely to emerge isolated. A settlement of this kind would secure outcomes Moscow values quietly more than territorial maximalism. Ukraine outside NATO, Europe back in energy entanglement, and America acknowledging, without ceremony, that Russia remains unavoidable. This is not victory. It is adequacy. In geopolitics, adequacy is often enough. Ukraine afterward, a state, carefully supervised, post-ultimatum Ukraine would exist much as it does now, sovereign in law, constrained in fact, praised in speeches, managed in practice. It would not be abandoned, it would be administered. History is filled with such arrangements. The novelty lies only in the transparency with which they are now performed. The cameras remain on, the decisions have moved off stage. Conclusion. Peace as maintenance. The alleged ultimatum is not cruel. Cruelty would require indifference. It is honest, brutally so. It acknowledges that America does not fight forever, Europe does not pay forever. And wars that promise moral clarity eventually deliver budget fatigue. The Ukraine war is not being resolved, it is being placed into maintenance mode, stable enough to persist, unjust enough to endure, unsatisfying enough to be permanent. And in the modern international system, that is not failure, it is how things are kept running.